The West is flirting with total chaos unless language returns to meaning and moral values return to absolutes.
I mean, what would you say to someone today who has difficult questions, doesn't find faith easy? Should they feel ashamed of that? Should they be labeled as a doubter? Or is there actually something good about that?
This is where secularism fails. It has no explanatory power for love. It has no explanatory power for ultimate meaning. Your worldview must be able to explain the undeniable realities.
Every question is an open door. And there's a real theological reason for that, because the answer to any question is something true, and all truth finds its grounding in God.
So when you say, I don't have to prove anything when there is no God, now you have to prove that life is purposeful. Now you have to prove that life has meaning.
There's going to come a point where corruption and suffering and death knock on your door, and you aren't going to be able to turn to hedonism at that point.
But no relativist ultimately is able to pin down relative to what or to whom. Is it relative to your upbringing? Is it relative to your culture? All these realities are the outflow of He not just speaking the truth, but He being the truth. And the truth shall set you free.
Good evening. My name is Bob Shetler. I'm pastor of the First Presbyterian Church here in Gainesville, Florida. And it is my honor and privilege just to say to you, wow, you're an encouragement to me. You've overwhelmed me by your presence and being here. Thank you for that. What I would like to say also, it's been my honor and privilege to serve on the Pray FLA team as well as the RZIM team for this event. And this has been a joy of my life to bring Ravi Zacharias and his team to Gainesville, Florida. Again, let me welcome you and thank you for being here. And all of you who are joining us by live streaming, we welcome you to Gainesville, Florida and the University of Florida here at the Exactech Arena in the Stephen C. O'Connell Center. If you're interested in seeing the live streaming, you can go to rzim.org/live. Tonight we're honored to have a few guests with us that I would like to recognize. First, I'd like to recognize the president of the University of Florida, Dr. Kent Fox, and his wife, Linda. I would also like to recognize Senator Keith Perry, his wife Amy, and daughters Amanda and Alexis. Thank you for being here, Senator. It's also a privilege to have Bill Hevner, the chair of the University of Florida Board of Trustees. We welcome you, Bill, tonight also. And then also from the Board of Governors of the university system, Tim Serio. Tim, thank you for your presence also tonight. Now let me give a disclaimer, if I may. If there's anybody else that I should have introduced, then you all introduce yourselves to each other, okay? So handle that for me. Let me give you kind of the role for tonight, the flow of the open forum. When I finish, we will go in this order. First, we will be hearing from Vince Vitale of the RZIM team. Second, we will hear from Ravi Zacharias. You may have heard of his name somewhere this week in Gainesville. And finally, we will have a Q&A opportunity for you to send in your questions, as Brandon told you, and that will be led by Joe Vitale, Vince's wife. If you're here tonight with questions that you just want to know about, we're so grateful you came, because that's what this is about. It's about the opportunity for you to do what I think Andrew did. When he saw Jesus, he wanted to follow him, and then Jesus said, come and see. So I believe you've come to see tonight. I believe that you've come to hear tonight, and I hope that you will send in your questions and that you will ponder and consider all that you hear for your life and what it means to you. The questions will be through Pigeonhole, and I encourage you to submit them. Pigeonhole.at. So remember that. If you have a smartphone, a tablet, or if you brought your desktop computer, you can still use that to do it. And so we want you to just go in there and launch your internet browser, and then you can put in this important code, UF18. UF18. Thank you for sending in your questions. It was several years ago in Orlando that I had the privilege of having lunch with Ravi Zacharias. He spoke to a group of leaders in Orlando, and then he spoke to us in depth about what he was about. Since then, I have followed his ministry. I have attended his conferences, and it's my privilege tonight to introduce him to you. To many of you, there's no introduction needed, but we want to cover a few things. I want you to know that in mind, we know that he was a former skeptic, 17 years old. Ravi heard of the words that Jesus gave us in John 14:19. Because I live, you also will live. The trajectory of his life changed forever. It was in that time of helplessness and unbelief, when he was on the bed of suicide, the truth of scriptures brought hope to Zacharias, and he committed his life to Jesus Christ. And he remembered those earlier words of Jesus, earlier in John 14. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. These verses have become the cornerstone of Ravi's ministry, the ultimate mission of Christian apologetics and evangelism, to present, defend the truths of Jesus Christ that others may find him. At the age of 71, Ravi, they put that in there. I didn't put that in there, okay? At the age of 71, he remains committed to his calling to represent the gospel of Jesus Christ through historical, philosophical, and moral foundations, to defend it against objectors with grace, clarity, and coherency. He has led the framework of truth of the gospel to millions of people in more than 700 countries, including on the campuses of some of the world's most prestigious universities, the University of Florida. Ravi is the founder of and president of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, which seeks to reach and to challenge those to shape culture with the credibility of the gospel of Jesus Christ. RZIM has 16 offices throughout the world, including an apologetic training center, Ravi Zacharias Institute, headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. He's authored 25 books in the fields of theology, apologetics, comparative religion, and philosophy. His wife, Margie, they have 3 grown children, and they live in Atlanta, Georgia. And what I would say to you is, I have been to that center in Atlanta, and I invite you to look at their conferences. It's an incredible experience. We'll hear from Ravi in just a few minutes, but first I'm excited to extend another personal invitation to a man that I met at Oxford University, or as they say over there, the University of Oxford. And I'd like to welcome Vince Vitale. Vince, welcome to Florida, to the University of Florida, your first time here. It was in the summer of 2016 when I was doing some continuing education at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford University that Vince spoke. And it was during that time we began the conversations about tonight, about this type of event for the church and the community of Greater Gainesville. And so, Vince, we had those discussions, and God honored that in our prayers of coming to this. Vince is the director of the Ravi Zacharias Institute. He was educated at Princeton and Oxford. He taught philosophy of religion and served on the faculty of both of those universities. It was during his undergraduate studies in philosophy at Princeton that Vince took an unexpected journey from skeptic to Christian. He then completed a master's and a PhD studies in Oxford. While researching at Oxford, Vince developed a new response to this problem of evil. This response, termed the non-identity defense, is discussed in his book that he co-authored with Ravi called Why Suffering? finding meaning and comfort when life doesn't make sense. Vince and Ravi have recently released a second co-authored book, Jesus Among Secular Gods. You may have heard of that term recently in this town. Vince is also interested in the intersection of faith and sports. He played soccer at Princeton, and he also boxed at Princeton. So I told him tonight that he becomes a kickboxer now. Don't you think? That would be a perfect thing for him to do. He served with Athletes in Action and teams in 4 continents, and he's incredibly grateful to be married to Jo. Jo also is on the team with RZIM. She will handle our Q&A tonight. She's the Dean of Studies at the Zacharias Institute, an itinerant speaker for RZIM. Prior to joining the U.S. team, she was in Europe, where she also taught at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. During her years at Oxford, Jo completed an MST in Biblical Interpretation and a PhD in Old Testament. God bless you. I just barely got through Old Testament to begin with, okay? From that, it was also in Oxford that at All Gates Church that Jo met and married Vince. Welcome, Jo. And now you've probably heard enough from me, so let's get on with why you came tonight. Vince Vitale.
Bob, thank you so much. Your friendship and partnership has been such a blessing. Dr. Fox, thank you for having us here to your wonderful university. Thank you for your support of this event. It means a great deal. And thank you all for being here. Really looking forward to the evening with you. I liked Bob's idea about kickboxing. I did have a brief stint as a boxer. Then Jo and I met and we got married. And I wanted to continue boxing. She thought it was time for me to take up golf. And so we did a marriage compromise. I'm not sure if you know about those. And I took up golf. Some married people in the room tonight. It's great to be here in this sporting arena. I've always been a lover of sports. But here's a sporting experience I would never want to have. Imagine being thrown into a game without knowing when it had started, when it will finish, what the objective of the game is, or what any of the rules are. What would you do? You'd probably ask the other players around you to answer those 4 questions. What if they answered with many different answers? Or what if they simply carried on playing, uninterested in your question, looking at you oddly for even asking it? Well, you'd probably then try to find a coach to answer your questions. But what if you saw the coach on the sidelines and he's looking at the chaos and he's just saying, "Great job, everybody. You're all doing fantastic. I've got a first-place trophy waiting for all of you." Well, then you'd probably try to find the referee or the umpire for definitive answers to your questions. But what if you learned that the players didn't like the calls that he or she was making and sent him home? It is our knowledge of the start, the finish, the objective, and the rules of a game that provide us with the freedom to play it and enjoy it in a meaningful way. If you don't know the answers to those 4 fundamental questions, all you can do on the field or on the court is pretend and hope that no one notices that you have no idea what you're doing or why you're doing it. Sadly, this is not just a game. This is real life. Many people are deeply confused about the answers to these 4 fundamental questions, which Ravi has delineated. Questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Where did we come from? Where are we headed? What is the purpose of life? And how should we live in light of it? How many of us can say with confidence that we have answers to those questions? How many of us are pretending our way through life? When I started college, I didn't think that Christianity had much to offer when it came to the deep questions of life. As a freshman, I was challenged to read the Bible for the first time. I was always up for a challenge, so I began to read through, trying to disprove it. And I would cross things out and I would add things. I'd write a big BS in the margins wherever I disagreed. And Christians would look over my shoulder and they'd say, Vince, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible? And I'd say, oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study. That's where I started. But things changed for me because I met a group of Christians who didn't spend their time tearing down my views. They had more confidence than that. They weren't afraid of my questions. They had this crazy idea that their God was big enough to handle my questions. And so they welcomed my questions and they invited me to seek answers together with them. I think we live in a very difficult time in history to seek answers when it comes to the deepest questions of life. There are many reasons for that, but I think one of the reasons is because we've become fearful of truth. Wasn't that long ago that The Economist suggested we live in a post-truth society? Shortly after that, right at the end of 2016, Oxford English Dictionary made post-truth its word of the year. Why have we become afraid of truth? Well, I think in part it's because experience has taught us that seeking truth leads to disagreement. And the fear is that disagreement will start you on a trajectory that will eventually lead to devaluing the people that you disagree with, and then to intolerance, and then to extremism, and then to violence, and ultimately to terrorism. And if that's the trajectory of truth, if truth starts you down a path that ends in extremism, violence, and terrorism, then truth is an act of war. And an act of war leaves you with only two options. Either you fight or you flee. Either you fight for truth and become a terrorist in the making, or you flee from truth in the name of love. Truth or love. I think that's the cultural ultimatum that we are living in. Jesus refused to make that choice. Jesus refused to choose between truth and love. That's one of the things I love about him. That's one way to understand the central message of Christianity. In fact, Jesus' ultimate communication of truth was in and through his very act of sacrificially giving his life for others. In his death, he communicated the truth about who we are, a people in need of saving, and the truth about who he is, a God loving enough to save. Love and truth perfectly united in a perfect sacrifice. And so if you are a Christian here tonight, I think that raises a really challenging question. Who are you giving your life for in order to be able to share the truth with them? I think every Christian needs to be able to answer that question. Let me put it in even starker terms. If the only way for the person sitting next to you to come to know and embrace the truth was for you to die, would you give your life for them? Jesus came and sat down next to us, and the only way for us to be united to the truth was for him to die. And he accepted that cost. He thought it was worth it for you and for me. For those of us who are Christians, I think the truth of our message will not be persuasive until we love others enough to be willing to give our lives for them, just as Jesus gave his life for us. How does all of this affect our discussion for tonight? Well, it means that I'm not interested in fighting and I'm not interested in fleeing. I'm not interested in fleeing from the truth for the sake of avoiding controversy. I think too much is at stake. But I also have no interest in fighting to win a debate just for the sake of it. What I want to do is figure out what questions every one of us needs to answer in order to live a coherent and a captivating life. And then I want to see if we can make some progress together, hopefully in a way that unites us rather than divides us. Isn't that the purpose of the university? To seek unity amid diversity. University. Let's start with origin. Where did we all come from? For a long time, my assumption was that Christianity offered the crazy answer to that question, and science offered the sober, sensible, rational answer. I've changed my mind about this, and here's why. Consider big picture explanations of the universe. How did all of this get here? There are only three primary options. Number one, God made it. Now, I might just put my hand up and say that's a pretty incredible option. But what exactly are the alternatives? Alternative number two, the universe just popped into existence from nothing for no reason whatsoever. Well, this too is a really incredible option. The physical stuff in our everyday lives doesn't generally just pop in and out of existence. If it doesn't now, why should I think that it did at the beginning? Option number three, the universe has always existed, extending infinitely back in time without any explanation. Well, now, perhaps each part of the universe can be explained by a part that came before it, but we still have absolutely no explanation for why there is a universe at all. This too is very odd. I call this the normalcy of the supernatural. These three options, they exhaust the relevant alternatives, and every single one of them is absolutely extraordinary. Every single one of them is well outside the realm of the ordinary. And even if you decide, you know what, I can see that all three of those options are a bit crazy, so I'm going to remain agnostic. I'm not going to commit myself to any of them. Well, it's still the case that logically you are committed to one of those three things being true. And that is just as crazy. The conclusion, I think, is that we live in a miraculous world. It doesn't matter whether you're a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic. I don't think anyone can get around that fact. Every one of us is committed to believing something extraordinary. I was reminded of this a number of years back when I received an email from an old friend of mine, a retired Princeton University professor in the history of science. And he was detailing some of his objections against Christianity. And then in the last line, as if to trump all other arguments, he wrote, "Nor can I believe in a virgin birth." No further argument, as if to say it would be crazy to believe in such a thing. And I began drafting an email back to him, trying to persuade him that maybe he could believe in a virgin birth. And then it dawned on me, he already does. Everyone believes in a virgin birth, whether they realize it or not. Let me explain. Christians believe that Jesus, as God himself, was born of a virgin, miraculously. Now, admittedly, that is out of the realm of the ordinary. But what exactly is the alternative? Take the brilliant Cambridge physicist Stephen Hawking's attempt to provide an atheistic birth of our universe. He says the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. Is that any less miraculous of a birth than the birth of Jesus? Hawking's proposal looks a lot like a virgin birth to me. Or consider the words of the prominent atheist philosopher Quentin Smith. This is a man with 12 books, over 150 peer-reviewed articles to his name. And here's what he has to say. He says, "The fact of the matter is that the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. We should acknowledge our foundation in nothingness and feel awe at the marvelous fact that we have a chance to participate briefly in this incredible sunburst that interrupts without reason the reign of non-being." That definitely sounds like a virgin birth. Again, I think we're led to the same conclusion. We live in a miraculous world, and there is no getting around that. It's not a matter of whether we believe in a virgin birth. It's just a matter of which virgin birth we choose to accept. We can believe in the virgin birth of an atheistic universe that is indifferent to us, a place where there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, as Richard Dawkins has put it. Or we can believe in the virgin birth of a God who loved us so deeply that he came to live among us and to be born beside us, to call us family and to call us friends. The exact opposite of blind, pitiless indifference. Someone who is not blind to anything about you and yet loves you. Someone who is not indifferent to anything about you but cares for you in every single detail. Someone who knows you in absolute full and yet loves you in full. What an incredible gift. Morality. Most of us believe in morality. We believe it's a real thing. We think that some things are good and some things are bad. We think that some things are right and some things are wrong. We believe that every single person should be treated with dignity and respect and fairness. We hold it to be self-evident that all people were created equal. At the foundation of the morality that we believe in and that we're grasping for is the belief that all people are equally valuable. But then that raises a question. For all people to be equally valuable, there has to be something which is equally true of every single person. What is it? What is the thing that is equally true of every single one of us and that cannot change and that therefore can ground the equal value of every single person, which is at the foundation of any plausible morality? It is surprisingly difficult to answer that question because all of our natural endowments are distributed along a spectrum. Some people are less intelligent than others, less happy, less wealthy, and less healthy. Some people are less useful for society, less good-looking, less capable of passing on their genes. And all of these things, they all change over time. So what is equally true of every single one of us and completely unchanging? Only one thing: the love of God. And not just any God. There are a variety of gods out there that say, I will love you if you're good enough, or I will love you if you believe in me. No, I'm talking about the extravagant, unconditional, no ifs love of the Christian God, which is for every single person and which cannot be earned and cannot be lost. Christians call it grace. It's my favorite word. It means unmerited love. The philosopher Robert Adams puts it this way. He says, grace is a disposition to love which is not dependent on the merit of the person loved. A gracious person sees what is valuable in the person he loves and does not worry about whether it is more or less valuable than what could be found in someone else he might have loved. Early on in our dating relationship, my wife Jo, at one point, she was a bit blinded by love, and she turned to me and she said, Vince, I don't deserve you. And I looked at her and I said, no, you don't. Bad move. Not recommended. Thankfully, I didn't start there. I said, no, you don't. And I don't deserve you either. Isn't it wonderful? How could we ever deserve another person as our very own? Surely that's beyond what any one of us could ever deserve. Love at its best is not about what we earn or merit or deserve. It's about grace. And I like that type of love. It's the type of love that means you don't always need to be looking over your shoulder or around the corner wondering if someone more worthy of love than you is going to come along. It's a love that's secure, and therefore it's a love that you can stop competing for and just enjoy. I wonder what the honest answer of your heart is to that question. Do you compete for love, or do you enjoy it? What if before the foundation of the world, God loved every single one of us with grace, with love that is a gift, with love that cannot be lost, with love that is exactly the same on your best day and on your very worst day. With the love of a parent staring down on a newborn child. That child can't do anything to earn the parent's love, and yet the love could not be more extravagant. The question, why do you love your child? It doesn't even make sense to the parent. What do you mean, why do I love my child? That's my child. I created him. He's in my image. He has my nose. The love of a parent who sees a son far off on the horizon, a son who took the family's money and went off and spent it on everything you're not supposed to spend it on, a son who did everything wrong, and yet the father sees that son while he's still far off, and he just takes off running like an embarrassing fool, and he runs to the son, and he throws himself on his son, and he kisses him, and he hugs him, and he gives him his robe, he gives him the family ring, he gives him sandals on his feet, and he yells back to the family and says, kill the best animal, we're throwing the biggest party you've ever seen, because this son of mine was lost, and now he's found. This is love that's not supposed to be earned. This is a love that is simply supposed to be returned. What if God loves us like that? That you are loved by God is the one and only thing about you that could never change. That is why it gives you your identity. And that is why it is the only truth that can found the equal value of every single person, which is at the foundation of any plausible morality. Meaning. A while back, I was on a university campus in Chicago, and on the way into the event, we had these whiteboards with different questions, and one of our questions was, what is the meaning of life? And across the top, we had different options: personal success, to find love, no meaning, to pass on your genes, to have power and influence, to achieve your goals. And students would confidently walk up to this board, and they would take the marker, and then they would stand there, and they would stare at it, sometimes for minutes on end, just paralyzed. Many of them had no idea how to answer that question. And I could hear the Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl in my head. People have enough to live by, but nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. People have enough to live by, but nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. What is the meaning of life? What does it mean for something to have meaning? Does this collection of letters have meaning? Well, it depends on whether someone put these letters side by side intentionally in order to communicate something, or whether it's just a random collection of letters. Meaning relies on intelligence and intentionality. My baby niece Camille's first word was "dada," and my brother was so proud. And then I walked into the room, and she said, "Dad, dad, dad, dad." And then the cat walked into the room, and she said, "Dad, dad, dad, dad." And then a cockroach walked into the room, and she said, "Dad, dad, dad, dad." And then my brother was no longer proud. Randomness is the enemy of meaning. Even if something appears to have meaning, it might not if it's not intentional. Even if something looks meaningful, it is only actually meaningful if it is the result of the intention of an intelligent being. Was our universe intended? Over the last 35 years, what's called the fine-tuning argument has strongly suggested that it was. Here's how. The universe we live in could have taken many different forms. And scientists have approached a consensus, not just Christian scientists, but scientists in general, that there are dozens of fundamental features of the universe that needed to be precisely the way they are for life to be possible. Not just life as we know it, not just life on the planet Earth, but any form of life anywhere in the universe. Take just one example. The explosive force of the initial expansion of the universe for life to be possible had to be within 1 part in 10 to the 60th of what it actually was. In other words, the percentage difference you could have while still accommodating life is a 0 followed by a period, followed by 57 zeros, followed by a 1. If the initial expansion had been just the slightest bit weaker, gravity would have made the universe collapse back in on itself almost immediately, far too quickly for any form of life to develop. If the initial expansion had been just the slightest bit stronger, particles would have dispersed literally into thin air. They would have dispersed so quickly and wound up so far from each other that all we could have got would have been cold, simple molecules, nothing like the sort of complex chemistry required for any form of life. Sir Roger Penrose, emeritus professor at Oxford, one of the world's leading mathematical physicists, he estimates that the overall difference you could have is 1 part in 10 raised to the power of 10, raised in turn again to the power of 123. I would write that out as a percentage, but even if I could change all of the matter in the universe into paper, I would still have far too little paper to print the required number of zeros. In fact, I would need more zeros than there are particles in the universe. Sir Fred Hoyle, the late Cambridge astronomer, one of the 20th century's most significant scientific thinkers, he compared the random emergence of even the simplest cell to a tornado blowing through a junkyard and just happening by chance to produce a perfect Boeing 747 airplane. These are the sorts of odds we're talking about. What explains this incredible precision in the universe? Imagine that by this point in the talk, you are unbearably bored. Hard to imagine, I know. You're unbearably bored, and so you break out a deck of cards. You start playing poker with the person sitting next to you. And in the first 12 rounds, they get 12 straight royal flushes. What should you think? How dare you insult your neighbor like that? Yes, of course, they're cheating. Why? Because even if the person sitting next to you is a very honest person, it's so incredibly unlikely to get 12 straight royal flushes just by chance that someone must be messing with the cards. Even if you thought there was only a 1% chance that the person sitting next to you would cheat, if you saw them get dozens upon dozens upon dozens of royal flushes, one after another, you would have no choice but to conclude that someone was carefully arranging the cards. Scientists tell us this is exactly what's going on in our universe. One royal flush after another. Could it be that the evidence warrants the same conclusion? Someone got their hands on the cards and carefully arranged the system. Someone designed the universe. The Bible says that you are a word, not just a random collection of genetic letters. More than that, it actually says that you're a poem. It uses the Greek word poema. That word is used for only 2 things in the Bible, to describe the natural world and then to describe you and me. Are you a random collection of genetic letters, or are you a poem that was intentionally and carefully crafted by God himself? Are you a sestina? That is the question behind the question of the meaning of life. Destiny. Where are we headed? Are we headed anywhere? I saw a commercial a while back. It depicted a baby being born, and then over the next 30 seconds, it fast-forwarded through the entirety of this child's life while the baby was flying through the air. So the baby was born, and then as it was flying through the air, it was getting older and older and became an adolescent, and then an adult, and then an old man, and then became hunched over in gray, and at the end of the commercial, crashed down into a grave, dead. And then the screen went black, and words appeared across the screen. And they said, "Life is short. Play more Xbox." And it was really funny. And it was also devastating. I laughed, and then I reflected on it. And I thought to myself, really? Is that the best we've got? My cousin Charles died a few years ago. He went to dinner with my Aunt Regina. He started choking on a piece of chicken. A minute later, he stopped breathing, and that was it. Play more Xbox? Really? Is that the best we have to offer my Aunt Regina in the face of that loss? Life is short, and it lacks meaning, and it's headed nowhere, so just nothing you could do about it? Just try to distract yourself and not think about it and spend more time on Facebook and Xbox? Is that really the best that we have? I stand amid the roar of a surf-tormented shore, and I hold within my hand grains of the golden sand. How few, yet how they creep through my fingers to the deep, while I weep, while I weep. Oh God, can I not grasp them with a tighter clasp? Oh God, can I not save one from the pitiless wave? Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? A dream within a dream. Edgar Allan Poe. What is our destiny? Will our dreams amount to anything, or will they all be swept away? For one of my birthdays when I was a little kid, I must have been about 8, I asked my dad to build me some steps up this massive tree that we had in the backyard. And I made a deal with him that every year on my birthday, we could add a few steps to the tree. And I thought it was so cool. I can remember thinking that many years from then, I'd be able to climb up hundreds of feet and look out over the entire neighborhood. When I was a child, I had these extraordinary dreams for the things I would do, for the person I would become. I had this great sense of destiny. Nothing seemed out of reach. What were your dreams for your life when you were a child? What were they 10 years ago? How about 5 years ago? What are they today? And how have they changed? Many people start out with extraordinary dreams, but by the time they are adults, they have ceased to dream like children. The harsh realities and disappointments of life chip away and chip away and chip away at childhood idealism until all that's left is adult cynicism. Albert Camus likened life to the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to roll a large stone up a hill over and over. He would roll that stone up the hill and it would roll back down. And then he would roll that stone up the hill again only to watch it roll back down once more. He worked so hard and never got anywhere. Camus called it never-ending defeat. Maybe some of us can relate. Life is short, and it lacks meaning, and it's headed nowhere. So just play more Xbox. Jesus Christ offers a better hope. About 2 years ago, I had a student named Ariel. She was diagnosed with a rare medical condition that meant her brain was prone to bleeding more than others. And she was told that she would probably have only a couple years left to live. And shortly after that, she told me that she found herself looking in the mirror, and she was testing the limited mobility she had on her right side. And the questions that popped into her mind were, is this the healthiest I'm ever going to be? Is this the strongest I'm ever going to be? Is this the prettiest I'm ever going to be? And then she told me of the amazing peacefulness that came over her as she remembered the answer to those questions. No, absolutely not. She told me of the joy of knowing that one day her body will be able to do far more than it has ever been able to do before. I remembered in that moment that she loves to snowboard, and so I asked her, do you think there will be snowboarding in heaven? And I wish you could have seen how unhesitatingly and how confidently she responded, absolutely. And soccer too. And I wish you could have seen the smile on her face as she said it. Would you have that confidence? Why could she have that confidence? Because of the resurrection of Jesus. If the resurrection is true, then what that means for you is that if it comes to a point in your life where it seems like there is no hope, if it comes to a point in your life where it seems like even death is inevitable and there's no way to escape it, well, death is not the end. There's more. There's hope, no matter what. The words of our dear friend, Nabil Qureshi, who we lost last year to cancer, but who we will see again sometime soon. Jesus has promised that we will see him in a place where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, because Jesus himself will literally, physically wipe away every tear. Jesus has promised that we will live together in his Father's house, a house that has many rooms. When Nabil and I lived in Oxford together, he lived in my same apartment building, 2 floors down. And as I was preparing this talk, I found myself wondering and smiling at the thought that maybe someday soon, Nabil will again live just 2 floors below. That is how real and concrete and tangible the hope of Jesus is. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Where did we come from? Where are we headed? What is the purpose of life? How should we live? Do we have answers? Or are we pretending our way through life? Are we from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing? Or are we from someone, by someone, and for someone? Is the center of reality impersonal, or is it personal? Is it random, or is it relational? Christianity offers answers to the deepest questions of life. One last critical question. Can we trust the one who is giving the answers? When I was about 6 years old, I was playing football on my next-door neighbor's front lawn, and I was getting knocked around pretty good. I started crying. I came running home to my mom, who was out on the front porch. There's my mom on the front porch she was on. She's sporting the classic 80s onesie there. And I came running up to my mom, and I'm crying, and I'm saying, I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough. So guess what my mom did? My mom did what any loving mother of a 6-year-old son would do. She positioned herself like this. She got down in quite an athletic stance. She looked at me lovingly. She hung her nose out in the air. And then she said, "Punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose." And I know what you're thinking. Crazy Italians. Guess this was the start of my boxing career. And indeed, she was crazy, but she persisted. She said, "Punch me in the nose, punch me in the nose." And I don't know what sort of psychological state I must have been in, but finally I did. I reared back and I gave my mom a straight right hand to the nose, and to my astonishment and to hers, blood actually began to come out of my mom's nose and down her face. You're learning a lot about my family. Then came one of the most gorgeous images I have ever seen. Through the blood came the most dazzling, radiant, joyful smile. And my mom said, "Now get back out there." And my mom sent me back out into that game, and she went inside to get cleaned up. You might not know what to make of that story. Understandably so. What a bizarre thing for my mom to do. What an unthinkable, messy, bloody thing to do. But also, what an extravagant display of love. My mom chose to bring me into this world. And she knew there would be challenges. She knew there would be confusion. She knew there would be suffering. But she was trustworthy. She was someone I trusted above all. Why? Because when the challenges came and my eyes filled with tears, she bent down and she stepped into my suffering with me, even though that meant suffering at the hands of her own child. And that is a picture of Jesus on the cross, where God did something unthinkable and messy and bloody, where God stepped down into our chaos and into our brokenness and into our confusion, even though that meant suffering at the hands of those he had created. We all need answers to the most fundamental questions of life, and we need them from someone we can trust. The person who can be trusted most is the person who is willing to suffer with you, the person who is willing to shed blood for you, the person who is willing to give their life for you. Only one God has given his life for you. Only one God came and sat down beside you, and when he had to choose to save his life or yours, he chose you. That is a God that we can trust, and that is the God that is my privilege to commend to you this evening. Why don't we all welcome Ravi Zacharias, my dear friend.
The older I get, the more I wish I could just sit down and enjoy the speakers. After all these years, I think I've done my bit. Last time I was here was 1997. So that was, 21 years ago. I don't know if my hair was black at that time or what, but I certainly did have more to cover this scalp. An honor to be here. We were in Egypt and Jordan over the last 2 weeks. Just landed a couple of days ago after finishing meetings in Amman and in Cairo. It was a fascinating time to be in the Middle East in the light of all that is really going on out there. So landed a couple of days ago, gave my wife a hug and said hello to the family, packed the bags and arrived here. And just for the record, I'm very grateful for all the accolades that were given to me, but I've been to 70, not 700 countries. I'm sure you figured that out. It is important for us to keep this sure, because I can guarantee you tomorrow morning we'll get a call in the office, somebody saying, is Ravi telling everybody he's been to 700 countries? I've had people write and ask me if Ravi Zacharias is really my name, or did I make it up? When I retire someday, I'm going to read all the mail that we get, all the accolades and all the brickbats and everything hurled, and it'll balance out at the end. Some years ago, I was traveling on a flight, and I was just putting my bags down, about to sit down, and a man across on the other aisle called me by my name and waved one of my books at me, said he was planning to read it on the plane. I felt pretty good about it. About 30 minutes later, I got up to go to the restroom, and I looked in his direction, and he was sound asleep with a book sitting across his chest. So I consoled myself by the fact that at least it was a cure for insomnia. But there's nothing like raising you up and then flattening you immediately after. What an honor to be here, especially in the alma mater of my good friend Tim Tebow, who has left his tracks out here. Maybe I'll end now and tell my wife it ended up with an ovation and I can leave. But Tim Tebow is a good friend of mine indeed, and we do stay in touch. And I thought I'd mention the connection in case, looking at me, you could see the same build that he and I had. A friend of mine used to tell me at college that my muscles are like gold, hard to find. Now that was just a joke, but my wife was serious one day. My wife's from Canada. They have a very subtle sense of humor in Canada. So I was giving her a nice big hug, and after I gave her a hug, she felt my arms, and she said, I want to tell you something. You really have the arms of a thinking man. Talk about a body slam, you know. And I looked at her and told her I'd do my best to develop the body of a non-thinking man. And she discouraged me for that too. All jokes aside, humor aside, thank you for coming out tonight on this weeknight. Nice to see a nearly full house. And to my friend Bob Shetler, thank you, sir, for all your hard work. And to President Fox and your leadership team with all the things you have to do today. The fact that you are here and taking in this session is a real honor and a distinct privilege for me. Even though I've done this now for nearly half a century, it's always a nerve-wracking experience. You never feel any more at ease. You're always all tensed up because one wrong word and you could be in trouble. So I am honored and thankful that you would pay us the respect of coming to give us a hearing, especially taking ideas from our book, Jesus Among Secular Gods. It was years ago, as I was reading Malcolm Muggeridge, I remember this comment that he made. He said, "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct." Fascinating insight from a man who observed culture, who himself had been through Russia and many other countries as a journalist and began to see where history was really going. It was Aldous Huxley who said, "We are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, rather in the grisly morning after, to see that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends. What all this knowledge may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means to obtain deteriorated ends." My education and life has not been anywhere near as formal as I would like it to have been. I wish I had been to more institutions and studied under some of the finest minds, but most of my education has come from sitting across a dining table and listening to people within the framework of their own culture, talking about the struggles and the vicissitudes of history that they have had to encounter, and the pain and the agony through which many of these civilizations have emerged. When you go to a nation like Lebanon today, where 1/3 of its people in this country, once upon a time called the Pearl of the Middle East, when you sit down after a meal, what you're listening to is questions like this: what do we do with over 1 million refugees from Syria? You go into Jordan and you see hundreds of thousands of refugees from Iraq, hundreds of thousands of them from Syria, and one man who's working with these folks, trying to find home and succor and sustenance and food, sitting around a table there that afternoon said to us, "We are suffering from what I call compassion fatigue. We no longer are able to dig deep enough to have the proper response to the misery with which we are living." Why present all of this at the beginning of a talk? It is because, ladies and gentlemen, we had dreamed somehow from the Romantic poets that man was being born again, that the 20th century would usher in some kind of a utopia, that all of the ambassadors in the United Nations would get together, and the more capacity we had to communicate, the greater the prospect of peace there would be. Instead, even in the last 24 hours, scientists have moved the clock one more point closer to a doomsday scenario. Whether it ever happens or not, who knows? But the fact is that the handwriting is on the wall, and our capacities are nowhere near in proportion to the character that will be demanded if we are to make this world a better place. We are living in extraordinary times. And one of the main reasons I keep going, even in the 7th decade of my life, where I could comfortably say, after 5 decades of travel, time to spend time with the family, time to be at home, time to give the body some opportunity to recuperate. But I'm a man living with a passion and a conviction that the answers of Jesus are more needed now than ever before in the 5 decades of my traveling back and forth presenting answers to people. Just today I heard from a man in Egypt and one from Jordan. Ravi, we miss you here. Please come back. I'm just one, you are many. And the Lord raises up more and more with the positive answers that we can give. What are the questions? How do we deal with the struggles such as now? And I'm so grateful to be teaming up with my colleague Vince. He's been such an inspiration to me, much more qualified than I am really to be addressing these issues. And as I team up with these younger minds, my hope grows steadily. And as I see you here, you wouldn't be here, most of you at least would not be here, if you didn't have at least an iota of interest in listening to what the answers are amongst the secular gods that now dominate the landscape. We are looking for at least one thing: coherence, within and without, something that will put our lives together on the inside so that we don't live with this dissonance and disconnect within our own thinking. And hopefully in the diversity of people and cultures and ethnicities, we can learn to live peaceably with each other. Starting in the 1970s, Daniel Yankelevich, the social theorist, said this: culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. Culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. But a genuine cultural revolution then is one that makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past, particularly those which relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and nature of human life. We are looking for shared meanings of the past, but a cultural revolution takes place when we break away from those shared meanings and somehow try to find some common ground, looking for coherence in the existential questions. But as we look at this horizontally, what has happened vertically has dramatic ramifications. Somebody wrote this: first, dentistry was painless. Then bicycles were chainless, and carriages were horseless, and many laws enforceless. Next, cookery was fireless, telegraphy was wireless, cigars were nicotineless, and coffee caffeineless. Soon oranges were seedless, the putting green was weedless, the college boy was hatless, the proper diet fatless. New motor roads are dustless, the latest steel is rustless, our tennis courts are swordless, our new religion godless. So trying to find answers on this horizontal axis while losing connection with any transcendent perspective has become the biggest challenge of our times. Now here it is, in the West we are really wondering if this person we call God really has any answers for us. You go to the Middle East today and there's the highest rate of turning away from the faith of their fathers and the largest number of atheistic-minded young people today in that part of the world, because they say religion has actually stolen from them their future and created havoc in the midst of those settings. It's fascinating to see two things. Number one, are we going to find any answers? And number two, religion alone is not going to give us the answer, especially if it is enforced and politicized. We cannot find answers in that kind of enforcement. What happened? I think 3 moods took place beginning from the 70s. I will go through them very quickly, and after that, Vince will join me on the platform and Joe will moderate as we take your questions. The 3 moods that took place, I deal with some of this in the book, is the mood of secularization, pluralization, and privatization. Each one of these are noble in their intent, but the side effects have been rather drastic and in many ways unwelcome. What is secularization? We have sociologists who have wonderfully described and defined these for us. One of the most famous of them, writing in the 70s, defined secularization as the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations had lost their social significance. A process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. In other words, it meant to bring religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations into the social fabric is no longer considered a legitimate option for us. We feel it is bringing to bear some kind of a dictatorial idea or ideology into a secularized society. Now, let me say this right from the beginning. I believe the process of secularization and secularism is the logical need for any government by which to manage a diversity of cultures. You institutionalize religion or you politicize religion, and both politics and religion lose their way. That's certainly half of the truth. But having said that, there's an implicit danger in that blanket statement. If you look at what religion did to politics in Germany, in France, in Russia, in the Middle East, and yes, even in my homeland of India, you see it has created more tensions and more distinctions between the people, those who do not want to abide by the mainline thinking of whatever is proposed. But if you take ethics away, you take a supervening moral reasoning away, what answers do we find then in having explanatory power for what is right, what is wrong, what is good, and what is bad? Let me explain this to you in very drastic terms. A few weeks ago, we were in Iraq. We were mainly in Kurdistan, but also went into Mosul. The devastation that has been created at the hands of ISIS are beyond description. Houses shattered, thousands murdered, subdivisions looking vacant, glass littering every home, and lives completely broken. As we were driving, we couldn't do that today, as some of them have made their way back. But I remember as on the last day, we were taken for lunch by a young Iraqi man, very solidly built. He took 3 of us out for lunch, and we were enjoying those shawarma sandwiches across there, that table, and he told us his story. He said, "Here's my story." He said, "I was a killer. I was a brutal killer. One of my brothers was murdered by the enemy ranks, and I had decided I was going to level the score one at a time. And so I was taking the lives of people, and I went into one room with a gun, shot a man dead in cold blood, put a bullet into his head as he was lying in his bed there to avenge the killing of my brother. Unknown to me, his 4-year-old son was lying next to him. And the son is shaken awake at the sound of this gunfire and blood spilling out all over him from his father's head. And this little boy sits up and looks at this man, the killer, and says to him, 'Where's my dad? What's happened to my father?' And he said, 'I just looked at him and he was holding my hand. What's happened to my father?' I pushed that hand away and looked down at him and said, 'Your dad's in paradise. He's in heaven.' And walked away. And he said, 'I left that room and sat amidst the pile of garbage cans, sobbing my heart out, crying uncontrollably and thinking to myself, what am I doing with my life? What am I doing to humanity?' It's a tragic story, but let me ask you this. What would be possibly worse than that feeling? To go out and have another meal somewhere and celebrate another killing and not have any twinge of guilt or regret or remorse. So here's my question to you. What is the ontic referent? What is the objective reality that we can point to that legitimizes the sacredness of life? Every life. What is that same reality that ought to work within your conscience and mine when we have done something so wrong that we are willing to sit in a garbage heap and weep and say, what am I doing to myself? What am I doing to humanity? You see, guilt is a legitimate thrust of the conscience when something is awry, when something is broken, when something is not right. What has secularization got to give to us as an ontic referent by which all of humanity can be bound? I can think of only one way and two ideas. When Jesus was asked to give the greatest commandment, he could have stopped at one. Moses gave 613. David reduced it to 15. Isaiah reduced it to 11. Micah reduced it to 3, to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly before your God. That was good. Jesus didn't reduce it to 1. He could have. Could have very easily stopped out of the first and said to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength. But he went on to say, and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all of the laws and all of the prophets. Do you realize on those 2 commandments, 613 laws were hanging? That the vertical and the horizontal are inextricably bound. I have no right to violate your life. I have no right to draw your blood. Jesus paid you the greatest compliment when he said you were created in God's image, and that means a moral reasoning capacity and the right to self-determination. No other worldview will give you this. And so secularization leads you to a point of not finding that ontic referent for why you are intrinsically valuable, or finding the imperative why I am commanded to love you, even if I disagree with you. You know, so many things happen in our lives about which I'm not allowed to say anything, because we meet under circumstances that are very precarious sometimes, very precarious. But my mind goes back to just one conversation in one country, and I'll keep it minimal. We were sitting across the table from a man whose ideology has wreaked havoc in this world. And 2 of my colleagues are sitting next to me talking. And his biggest challenge was this: he could not differentiate between a person and his or her belief. They were so interwoven, he said, that violence was the logical outcome. If you disagree with a person's idea, you are free to do away with them. A 2-hour discussion on just that Jesus comes into the world to lead us from error into truth, but to always love the person, never to devalue the person. And the man sitting across discussing with us had no way to differentiate between the two. The way to solve this world's problems is get rid of the people who hold the ideas you don't like. Fascinating to see how impassioned he was about his belief and the answers that we were trying to give. Secularization is a great idea as a general rule over against the diktat of religion. But I'll tell you what, if secularization does not find the transcendent ethic and the value of every human life, it will lead to ultimate slaughter and a society that does not have any remorse or any guilt or any shame. You show me a human being who never has any remorse, I will show you a monster. Secularization takes away the grounds for moral reasoning in absolutes, and certainly grounds to treat your fellow human being of intrinsic worth. So we moved to the next mood that came around, and that was pluralization. Pluralization is where the sociologists tell us is a competing number of worldviews that are available to its members, and no worldview is ultimately dominant. A competing number of worldviews available to its members, and no worldview is ultimately dominant. What happens when that takes place? You may come from a different culture to me. My wife, as I told you, is Canadian and I'm Indian. And you know, in India, we refer to ourselves as Dharti ke Aadmi, people of the soil. And there is a song that was very popular in India. It said, Mera juta hai Japani, patloon Englistani, sar par lal topi Rusi, phir bhi dil hai Hindustani. So my shoes may be Japanese, my trouser English, my hat may be Russian, but my heart is still Indian. You can't take that out of you. You can take the person out of the country. You can't take that ethnic reality out of their soul and out of their heart. And so we see values that come from completely different backgrounds. We think only of the problem of racism. The problem of racism is symptomatic of value differences that come within the heart, even of cultural and ethnic differences. But we go back to the same question. If secularization takes away from you the ontic referent for guilt and shame and moral reasoning, pluralization has a problem where we really don't have the ability to arrive at how to get along with each other. Peter Berger did seminal work in this field, and I had the privilege of interviewing him one day on a radio program. But here it is. I want to anchor this and move to my final thoughts so that we give you some time for questions. G.K. Chesterton, talking about rebellion in society, that which wants to throw away any shared meaning of the past, that which does not want to have any shared values, but you're rebelling and overthrowing. He wrote a powerful 2 paragraphs that summed it up. He said this: the new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern skeptic doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. As a politician, he will cry out that war is a waste of life. Then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is forever engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt becomes practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. The confusion that comes. And that's what's really happened in Hollywood today, hasn't it? They have a right to complain of the exploitation of people for the sake of progress in society, but often the entertainment world itself exploits people and comes into your life and mine through the back door of the imagination rather than the front door of reason. A pluralized culture is a privileged culture, but a pluralized culture that lives in tension within itself without finding the answers again for moral reasoning is truly a very dangerous culture. And so we end up living with systemic and systematic contradiction. Notice these moods, as Peter Berger would say, are good things. Secularization, pluralization. But secularization can lead to no shame when there's no transcendent ethic. Pluralization moves into tension points where we try to learn how to even get along with each other, and we find out it is nowhere near as easy. It is not so much a question of race as it is a question of values. The values that we hold shape what you and I are. Values come out of convictions. Foods and colors come out of opinions. You can change your opinion with time, but you cannot change your conviction without changing who you are. And so pluralization has a wonderful privilege of living together with other people. But what is the worldview that is going to be dominant if we in the West are to survive? I remember when I arrived in Canada, I was 20 years old, and it was 1966, and I was living in Toronto, Canada at that time, and watching culture on a change. I was a new follower of Jesus Christ, from having tried to take my own life at 17 to the new meaning and purpose he gave. I was working in the hotel industry. That's what I was preparing for in a career in the future, the hospitality world. And I would leave the hotel at about 2 in the morning, and I would see things happening there night after night, late hours, and I'd say to myself, I hope I never take on the habits that I'm watching take place. I hope I never lead such a reckless life in what I see happening. And it was a shock to my system to find out how many customers sitting by the bar room at 11 or 11:30 at night would start talking about how lonely and desperate their living really was, how desperate they were in trying to find hope and meaning. See, secularization breaks down shame. Pluralization breaks down reason. It leads me to my final thought. So what are we told in the West? Privatization. As Peter Berger reminds us again, that your religious life, your religious convictions, your spiritual convictions should be kept in private and never brought into the public sphere. And that's exactly where life breaks down and life becomes empty and meaningless, when your values are to be told you must keep them in private, but don't bring them into the public arena. We are living this fragmented, disjointed existence. And so I want to close with one particular thing here and tell you what is the greatest struggle that we really have. The greatest struggle we have in life, if I understand you as a typical university student, and that I have, is in the search for meaning. Where are we going to find meaning in life? We have to start off by giving a definition. Who are we? Viktor Frankl says this in one of his books: if we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him. When we present him as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment, we feed the nihilism to which modern man is prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp of Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazi liked to say, of blood and soil. I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek are ultimately prepared not in some Ministry of Defense in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. It was not prepared in the Defense Ministry, what happened in the Holocaust. It came from the desks of faculty and professors of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Powerful statement. And so as I so respectfully look at your faculty, bumped into one of them on a flight last night while I was flying in, came and greeted me and welcomed me and said, "So glad you're coming to our campus." Faculty members have a huge responsibility in our time, training young minds like yours to tell you who you really are, because of the desks and philosophies can be given to young minds that show them they have value and intrinsic worth. Think of what is really going to be the difference that will make. Let me give you one illustration, give you a last quote and illustration, I'll be done. In 92, I think it was 92, three visits, but one of them was in what is the former Soviet Union now. What was the former Soviet Union, and now and all to the Balkanized state that we have. A general by the name of Kirshen invited me to speak there. After all these years, I made connection with him in the last month, and he sent me a beautiful letter inviting me to come back and visit. While I was speaking at the military academy there that he invited me to speak at, they were all atheists as professors, all of them, and their questions were pointed, poignant, harsh, tough. My wife on one side, my colleague on the other side. One of the things I shared with them shook them, and the professor and the The general and I talked about it again as I went over the story with him. It's so long ago, I forget the sequence in which it happened, but the story that brought him to tears was this. They were trying to defend all of their ideology and all of their philosophy, and I was talking about how atheism ultimately will kill values in a nation. And I told them of Joseph Stalin, how he viewed people. A foreign dignitary had come to visit him and looked at him and said, "How long do you plan to keep torturing your people and think they will follow you?" Stalin never answered the question. He called the waiter and asked him to bring a live chicken to him. Stalin took that chicken, clutched that chicken, and started to defeather that bird. While it was struggling to break free from him, he was denuding it. And finally, completely denuded, while this dignitary was looking on, he took that denuded bird and put it down on the floor, took a piece of bread and walked away. And the chicken hobbled over towards him and nuzzled between his trouser legs. And he bent down with a piece of bread, and the chicken pecked away at it. He said, "Madam, do you have your answer?" He said, "I tortured this chicken. It will follow me for food the rest of its life. People are like that chicken. You torture them, they will follow you for food the rest of their lives." He obliterated 15 million of them. I kid you not, the general's lips began to quiver. And I said to him, "General, your greatest need is the same as my greatest need. I need a heart that needs to be changed so that I will love God and love my fellow human being. You have the need for Jesus Christ to change your heart. He's the only one who's big enough to change it." I had the privilege of praying with that general. And as he writes back, he doesn't speak English. We are always using an interpreter. Through one of my interpreters, he wrote back. He said, "I have a small apartment. I've never forgotten you. Please come and visit me again. I'd love to have you here. I can't have you stay with me. My apartment is so small, but I have never forgotten you." Let me close. The man who killed the man lying next to his son lives in Iraq today. And after he took us out for lunch, my colleague was with me as we had that lunch, and he told the story. He said, "I sat in that garbage heap, sobbing my heart out, so upset. And I tried to sleep, but every time I fell asleep, I had a dream. And in that dream, I was seeing Jesus, and I was even angrier than before, inviting me to come to him." This is his story. This is his story. 3 times in that same garbage heap, he says, Jesus comes to me in a dream. He said, "I was angry first, gave my life to Jesus Christ. Now he works at a hospital in Iraq, binding the wounds of the broken and helping people get better and get well." The heart has been so dramatically changed for this man. Moving from an ordinary killer to a philosopher like Anthony Flew. When I was studying in the 80s, Flew was the big atheist. You had to read everything Anthony Flew wrote. And as he comes to the tail end of his life, he starts his search for God again. And what does he say? 2 things. 2 things. The moral reasoning we need was not explainable in his naturalistic framework, number 1. Number 2, he said, if Jesus really rose again from the dead, if I could be convinced of that, that would be the point of reference to transform my own thinking. And he referred to N.T. Wright's book in the Resurrection. He said, C.S. Lewis, with his moral argument, and N.T. Wright writing on the resurrection are the 2 arguments I'm so struggling with and trying desperately to come to terms with. Ladies and gentlemen, that is your struggle and mine too. How do we separate good from evil? How do we know whether we live beyond these 70 years and 10? Those 2 are the hinges. May I close with a poem written by Francis Thompson, who was a drug addict and ran most of his life from God. And he was at Charing Cross buying his drugs, and by the river Thames, where he would lie by the river at night. He'd run away from home. He'd wrap his dirty raincoat by the river Thames and sleep at night. In the day, he would go and sell shoelaces and pencils till he could make some money to buy his drugs. He began to read the Bible and was reading about Jacob. And then he wrote this: O world invisible, we view thee. O world intangible, we touch thee. O world unknowable, we know thee. Inapprehensible, we clutch thee. Does a fish soar to find the ocean, an eagle plunge to find the air? Do we ask of the stars in motion if they have rumor of thee there? Not whether wheeling systems darken or our benumbed conceiving soars, the drift of pinions would we hearken, beats on our own clay-shuttered doors. The angels keep their ancient places, touch but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis your estranged faces that amiss the many splendored thing. But when so sad thou canst not sadder, crying upon thy so sore loss, shall shine the traffic of Jacob's ladder, pitched between heaven and Charing Cross. Yea, in the night, my soul, my daughter, cry clutching heaven by the hems, lo, Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret, but Thames. He walks in Charing Cross, and he walks by the river Thames. He's here in this auditorium at the University of Florida tonight. May you hear his voice and him calling to you, saying, this is the way, walk ye in it. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi. For those of you hoping for a matching New Jersey accent to go along with Vince's, I'm very sorry to disappoint. There are a lot of people here who are hungry for answers, and we've had so many questions coming in. So we will be moving into a time of Q&A now, which is great because it means I can finally take my revenge on Vince for all the ways that he publicly embarrasses me. And just to clarify, when Vince said that once we got married, he took up golf for my sake, what he actually meant was that he took up surfing, and typically in shark-infested waters. But if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so online by going to pigeonhole.at if you haven't already, and then keying in our event passcode, which is UF18. That's UF18. And just a reminder to please keep your questions clear, concise, and relevant to tonight's discussion. And also a reminder that we will be prioritizing questions from the perspective of seekers and skeptics. Okay, so we've had so many questions come in, so we're going to move to our first question of the evening, which a lot of people have already been voting for. And the question is this: what is your answer to the absence of free will? If God created every fiber of our being, every atom, every impulse, did he not also create sin? Did he not also create Satan and his actions?
Let me go first, and then Vince will give you the substance of it. I'll take a stab at that. If the question is to hold together every assumption that is in that, what is the purpose of God doing that? Then, of course, I'm assuming you also are wanting God to remain in the paradigm and that he is the creator of the universe and your life and mine. When you know that an infinite, perfect God has created you and me, there are only 4 possibilities of God and creation. Number 1, that God would create nothing at all. Number 2, where he would create a world where there was no such thing as good or evil, an amoral world. Number 3, where he would create a world where we would only choose good. Or number 4, create this world where there's the possibility of good and evil with the freedom given to us. No creation, amoral world where we would only choose good, or create a world like this where he has given us the freedom to choose good and evil. This is the only one of the 4 worlds in which love is possible. If love is the supreme ethic, and love is the ethic towards which and the longing towards which we all strive, this is the only one of the 4 possibilities in which love is given to us as a legitimate possibility. Let me give you the illustration from a child and then move into some philosophical extensions of that. You know, when you are a parent, you look at life very differently than before you raise your first child. Then when you're a grandparent, you look at it even more differently than you did when you were a parent. When you're a parent, you are so preoccupied with the worries and the fears that your time is given over to that stress, dissonance. When you've got grandkids, the wonderful thing is somebody else does the worrying, and you can just hug and hold and say goodbye at the end of the day and get your life back again and get your house back again. I don't know why a country musician has not yet written a song about this. As soon as they go, you get your house back, you get your toys back, you get everything back. You know. But I watched my grandkids. G.K. Chesterton said he learned more from observing children than he ever did from studying philosophy. My 3.5-year-old grandson, Jude, who is now 6, he's a guy with an amazing vocabulary. I don't know where he gets it from, but he's got it. He's the guy who dangles his feet at the table and looks across the table and says to you, Papa, well, he's 6 now, so he was about 5, and he looked at me and he said, Papa, what is the meaning of sophomoric? Who's teaching this guy? Where is he getting all of this from? So when he's 3.5, he's a wee little tyke, sweet little boy, precious little guy. And his mother had lost her car keys, and she's looking all over the place and can't find it. She pauses, our daughter Naomi, slaps her forehead and says, I must be losing my mind. Jude comes and stands in front of her and said, Mommy, whatever you do, please don't ever lose your heart because I'm in there. Tell me, where does he come up with something like that? The longing to look at his mother and say to her, don't ever lose your heart, I'm in there. Love is the craving of the human heart to belong in the sacredness of trust and a relationship. And that is what you long for and I long for. God, in giving us freedom, gave us the greatest possible gift we could ever have with the greatest possible vulnerability at the same time. And once you know him and follow him and love him and enjoy his love, you will realize that for the sake of love and for the sake of that relationship with you, he gives you that freedom. And there are only 2 kinds of destinies that you have. You can bend your knee to God, said C.S. Lewis, and say to him, your will be done. Or you refuse to bend that knee to him and he says to you, your will be done. If you really wish to enjoy the freedom of what this gift is all about for creativity and all, then this is the world that gives you the possibility of love and the beauty of the sacredness of a relationship. The more you get to know him, the less you ask the other question, because you know in his wisdom he has an explanation that in time and in eternity will be ultimately revealed. Let me give you one illustration and turn it over to Vince. You take your 2-year-old to a doctor for an injection, and the doctor is about to jab that needle, and the 2-year-old starts screaming and sits at the back of the car, and on the way back says, I don't understand my mother. She brought me here for him to jab this in my arm. Not only that, I saw her paying him for doing that to me. And then comes a few years that go by, and there's a disease stalking the land. And that little one has grown up and said, if my mother hadn't done that, I would be a victim for what exactly is plaguing the country now. Time is a necessary component for understanding the big picture. I have no doubt God gives us the big picture when we say, I now get it. That is my brief answer to you. Thank you.
Well, one way to understand this challenge is that God is all good and God only creates good things. So how is it that putting good things together, if that's all that God creates, could wind up with sin and evil? Let me just quickly give you a more trivial example, but one that I find helpful in understanding this, and then a more serious illustration from my life. The example that I find helpful is going to a buffet. Anyone like going to a buffet? I really like going to a buffet, but I am not a good buffet eater because I go to the buffet and everything individually looks great. And I'm not able to process the fact that some of these things don't go well together. And so I put all of them on my plate, and it doesn't go well then or for the rest of the night. That's how I think about this. God only creates good things, right? He creates the power for me to move my arm. He creates the power for me to have free will. They're both good things. I can use my arm to help someone up. But if I put those two things together in the wrong way, then it's not a good thing. And the more serious illustration in my life that makes me reflect deeper on this is of someone who, as a child, I can remember as a teenager, I wasn't very kind to him and he wasn't very kind to me. And I used those powers that God gave me to push him down rather than to help him up. And I remember taking every opportunity I could to put this guy down. And then I learned a number of years ago that he had taken his life. And at one point the Bible says, for the wages of sin is death. And I had read that verse hundreds of times, and it never really hit me until then. And I had to start asking questions like, would he have taken his life had I been kind to him? Had I used those very same powers of the movement of my arm and of the free will not to push him down, but to help him up? And I didn't know the answer to those questions. Sometimes I think we're too quick to look up and blame God for the evil in the world, and we're too slow to look to ourselves and turn that question around and ask, what is our part in that? G.K. Chesterton was once asked to write into a newspaper with an answer to the question, what's wrong with the world? And he wrote a very short letter. He wrote, Dear Sirs, I am sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton. And so sometimes I think we're too quick to look up and blame God, ironically the same God who, when he was hanging down a cross, looked at the ones who were producing evil in his life, and the instinctive words of his heart were, Father, forgive them.
Thank you. We've had a lot of questions coming in about hell, so it would be great if you could answer this one for us. If God is just, then why give the eternal punishment of hell for temporal sin?
Thank you.
Glad we could do your question.
Thank you for that question. It's a really, really good one, and not just the question about hell, but that idea of eternal punishment for temporal sin. I see that distinction in your question, and it makes it a harder question, and I appreciate that. Let me start off, if it's all right, because I can continue on from what I was saying. I think sometimes we vastly underestimate our sin and its consequences in this life. You know, sometimes when I try to explain the idea of sin to people, they want to say to me, well, really, you're exaggerating. You're not too bad. It's not like you've killed anyone. Well, I just told you that story of the guy from my childhood who went on to commit suicide. So if you ask me that question, have I killed anyone, that's actually a much more difficult question for me to answer than you might think it is. And then what are the consequences of the way I use my free will in his life, him taking his life? What did that do in the context of his family? What will that do in the context of the future generations to come? It's sobering to think about that. You know, sometimes I can look back on my life as a teenager right now and say, man, I thought at the time that was no big deal, but the reality was that was truly terrible. Well, any progress I have made in life, it's about that much. Imagine how far along this path God would be. Imagine if the standard is not someone you see on the 6 o'clock news who has done something worse than you so you can feel better about yourself. What if the standard is a perfectly holy God? A perfectly holy God who loves each one of us. What would our sin look like from his perspective? And the multiplying and the exponential effects of that sin. Maybe Jesus gives us an idea in some of his statements that lust would look like adultery, that unjust anger would look like murder. So temporal sin, eternal punishment, when I think about the reality of my sin, I don't see the gap the way you might initially presume that it is there. But now let's talk just briefly about this idea of hell itself. How are we to understand this idea? I think one of the best ways to understand it is in a relational framework. Jesus invites us into relationship with himself. A relationship can only be entered into if both people say yes to that relationship. If we are not willing to say yes to that relationship, then there's nothing that Jesus can do on his side. Sometimes people say, why is Jesus the only way to heaven? And I answer, well, because Jesus is heaven. That's what heaven is. Why is Jesus the only way to eternal life? Well, because Jesus is eternal life. Flourishing relationship with the God who created you and desires to be in friendship and relationship with you more than anything. That's what eternal life is. It's not just some theme park that we get a ticket to and then we can go or decide not to go. It is the relationship itself. And that's why someone like Christopher Hitchens said, heaven would be hell for me. Why? Because he doesn't want to be with God. Because he said that explicitly at one point in his life. People like Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, they say, I don't want to be with God. It would be an invasion of my privacy. It would take away my autonomy. That's not attractive to me. Well, if that's not attractive to you, then God is not going to force you to be with him. And being apart from him in the context of eternity, that's what we call hell. It's interesting that the Bible uses a phrase when it refers to hell at times. It talks about weeping and gnashing of teeth. That may seem like a very harsh phrase to you, and it always did to me as well. But in my family, we've dealt with a lot of estrangement. At one time, 2 uncles of mine, they didn't speak for about 7 years. But I have a vivid memory of the 2 of them being at a wedding together. They both had to be at this wedding. They had to be in each other's physical presence and yet relationally estranged. And you know what I saw on their faces? Literally weeping and gnashing of teeth. That is the natural reaction to being in the presence of someone who you know full well you're supposed to be family with, the person who is supposed to love you most, the person you were intended to be in the deepest friendship with, and knowing that there's nothing other than your own stubbornness that keeps you from being together with them. That all it would have taken on either side, just one of my uncles, to say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And that relationship would have been restored. And it is the same with God. He will not force that upon us, but if we will just say, I'm sorry, there is nothing he desires more deeply than relationship with each one of us.
Well done. You know, it's fascinating when we're asked questions like this, we ask them of ourselves too. We often think of these questions and struggle with it. When you read the story of the younger son going out and squandering all the father's wealth and returning, there are always surprises in Jesus' stories. In fact, many of you may know the name of Nabil Qureshi, who passed away, my colleague. He and I were in the process of co-authoring a book. And with Nabil gone, Abdul Murray has taken that role now, and he and I are writing a book on the whole life of Christ through Eastern eyes. When you listen to the stories of Jesus, there are surprises in them that are both explicit and extended. You don't expect that story to end that way. The younger boy coming home, I come from the East. If I'd taken my portion of the wealth, my dad didn't have much, but if I'd taken it and gone and squandered it and then returned, I know what my dad would have done. Tell him to come right here and fall on his face, and I want to talk to that boy. But the story surprisingly ends in 2 ways you don't expect. The first is that the father gathers his robes and he runs outside to welcome the son back. That's the grace of God extended in the gospel message, which is very unique. Please hear me now. In every other worldview, salvation is earned. Your good deeds have to outweigh your bad deeds. Your righteousness has to exceed your unrighteousness. Your karma has to be paid. Only in the gospel message is salvation a gift, the gift of grace, unmerited by you. So the Father comes out. The father comes out to receive the son. That's a surprise in the Eastern story. But there's a second surprise. There's an older brother who's pretty upset. He said, "What's this? I've been here all along, and he's the boy who's getting the party. What do I need to do?" You see, he's the one who had never enjoyed the love of the Father, even though he lived under the same roof. He never got to break free from his own selfishness to enjoy the love of the Father. I say to you, to somebody who doesn't want God, even heaven would be hell for that person. Goodness would be an angering thing to the individual. All I can tell you is this: if any man comes unto me, Jesus says, I will in no wise cast him out. You have the opportunity to come to him. If you desire not to be with him, he will second your motion, and that is a choice you make for time and eternity. There's a younger boy who repents. There's an older boy who's in the house, but never really enjoys being with the dad. You and I can fall into one of those two categories.
Next question. Is God okay with people being transgendered? Does the Bible say anything against it?
See it up there?
Well, thank you for this question, and I suspect it may be a very personal question for multiple people in the room and watching. And so I want to be sensitive in the way that I answer it and admit to you up front that I don't have a perfect response to this issue, which is becoming more and more prevalent, and we're thinking about more and more. But let me offer a couple of thoughts. One, I want to affirm this feeling of a gap between who we feel ourselves to be and what ultimately we're intended to be, or the way that we are now and the way we feel that we ought to be. That gap there. The Bible affirms that gap. It says that we're living in a broken world. It says that the creation itself is groaning for restoration. So if you feel that gap in yourself between where you are and what you feel like you ought to be, the Bible affirms that experience, that feeling. The question is our gender something that is given to us or something that we need to create ourselves? Now, if we're working within an atheistic framework, then we have no choice but to try to create our identities ourselves in a variety of ways. I think that can be a great burden. I referenced Camus earlier. He spoke about this as picturing someone carrying, like Atlas, carrying the entire world on their back, that burden of having to create your own identity. If we're talking about this within a Christian framework, then we don't need to create our own identity. Our identity in various respects is given to us by God. And God created people, according to the Bible, male and female. Now, there may still be this gap between where we feel that we are and where we want to be. There may be a gap between what we are biologically and what we feel. God's love for us is holistic. Okay, He loves us as full beings, not just our emotions and our psychology and our feelings, not just our bodies. He loves both of them. And He's the one, if He exists, who knit us together in our mother's wombs and knows us better than anyone. So He loves us in our physicality and our biology, and He loves us in our emotions and our psychology. And His promise is that there can be restoration and reconciliation for them. And here, I think, is the amazing thing. Why should we trust God? Why should we trust Jesus with something as significant as that in our lives? Well, I think it's because Jesus himself experienced something of a mismatch between who he was and the body that he was in. Jesus himself, the incorruptible God, took on a corruptible body. And there was a mismatch there in some sense. And yet, because he was God himself, he was able to die and then rise again with a redeemed body that was fully restored and fully reconciled. And so why, if you are going through this yourself and you're dealing with it personally and you're saying, this is really, really tough, and what the Christian faith asks of me is really tough because it's asking me to trust that there can be this reconciliation, this restoration of two things that seem to be part of me, and I don't see how that can happen. Well, the question is there a God big enough and loving enough who can do that? Did that God actually reveal himself in history? And did he reveal himself in history in a way that shows us that he understands exactly what you're going through? Because he took on a body that didn't feel right. But he was able to go through that and rise with a redeemed body. And because he knows exactly what it is that you're going through, that's why, if that's true, you can trust him with your gender, with both your physicality and with your emotions, and you can trust that he is leading all of this towards a time where there'll be no more mourning or death or crying or pain. And we forget sometimes what a thin slice of time it is that we live in right now and how much different things could be one day. But what if it is the case that one day it is like waking up from a dream? And that is how much more real and rich and substantive and true our lives will be then, and the wholeness we will experience then will be compared to what we experience now. I think that's a beautiful hope and promise that Jesus offers, and he offers it to anyone who's struggling with this issue.
I'll keep my answer brief. I will recommend for you a book by Mark Yarhouse, and it's called Gender Dysphoria. And Mark, in his book, gives us basically the three models with which you respond to such a very difficult question. He calls it the integrity framework, where one may come down upon a person and say, you know, you've got the choice between A and B, and you retain that integrity. He goes to the second option, which is the disability framework, and he says those sociologists or others who may look at it as a disability type thing, and he says neither of these two are meeting the needs that people are really asking about. So he gives the diversity framework and talks about the options that we live in our culture today. You need to look at those three frameworks that Mark Yarhouse presents and see which of his arguments really are appropriate for you. So let me just give you a simpler answer on this subject on the footnote of what Vince has said. One of the things that we face as Christian apologists is a diversity of opinions on these things and people who really and genuinely hurt over decisions like these. We know the deep anguish with which people come to talk to us. We've got people on our team who are specifically qualified that address this issue and deal with it from experience in matters that they themselves have struggled with. You know, there's a fascinating passage in the Old Testament when Naaman is suffering from a certain disease and he comes to see Elisha, and Elisha prays over him and heals him. Naaman the Syrian is shocked that this prophet of Israel has laid his hands on him and made him well. He asks an incredible question and receives an even more incredible answer. Naaman looks at Elisha and he says, I have a question for you. I know who your God is, and I know this is the God I now worship. When I go back home and work for my master, he takes me to the temple, and in that temple he leans on my arm and asks me to bow down with him by the pressure he puts on my arm for me to kneel to. Elisha, what should I do? I knew that question was very sensitive because it comes from my culture in the same way. You're asked to celebrate a festival that is not in keeping with what your own faith is, but many times you're asked by friends, would you like to come to the temple and just celebrate this festival with me? Elisha looks at Naaman and says, go, and God will be with you and will guide you. Elisha doesn't play God for him. Elisha says, go, and God will be with you and God will guide you. So I just give you one little answer in this. Please ask a question about yourself, not what you are, but who you are. That's the first question. Who am I, Lord? Not what am I, who am I? And once you gain your identity in Him, all other identities can be defined for you as well. He will tell you who you are. And I will just tell you, ask God the question as you read His Word, and He will guide you. I will not play God in your life. You lean on Him, He will guide you.
Well, there have been so many questions that have come in, but to be respectful of your time, this is going to be the last one this evening. Why do I have to accept someone who died for me if I don't want to? If someone, Jesus, dies for me when I never asked him to for his own glory, isn't that selfish and prideful?
Think carefully. Who's the one who's wrestling with pride here? God who is perfect, or you and I who are imperfect? I think, fair enough, it's a great question, and I think it either comes from your heart or it's coming on behalf of somebody else, that someone else has raised this question for you. You know, I was speaking at one of the major universities, and some guy had written an article about me. I don't normally read any articles about myself. I've got enough problems without reading them. And so somebody just told me that some guy had said, your apologetic is very anecdotal rather than argument-driven, it's anecdote-driven. And I said, actually, he's right. We move from story to argument, not from argument to story. I come from the East. And I said to him, do you know what? In your one criticism, you have basically done away with the entire Hindu scriptures, the Gita, which is a story. You have done away with the traditions of Islam, which is the Hadith. They are anecdotes and stories. You think by giving an argument you've solved the problem. And I said, if I say something like this to you, why don't you believe in God? You'll tell me that maybe there's too much evil in the world, and then I'll ask you what you mean. And then you might say, you know, I had a friend who died of cancer at the age of 10 or 12 or something. You go to the anecdote also. You just go to it the other way around in order to illustrate your point. We go to the anecdote to build the argument. And so let me start off with this way. Sin is a capital offense. It's a capital offense. You reject God, and bear in mind, Jesus Christ didn't come into this world to make bad people good. He came into this world to make dead people live. You and I are dead to God. He came to make us alive unto God. He didn't just come to make me a very good person from being a very bad person. The reality is the heinousness of sin. It is so awful when sin becomes evil. Sin in my heart can be isolated in my expression. What is it? It's choosing my own way rather than God's way. But then, if I propagate that sin and multiply that sin, it sort of becomes evil and becomes like a cancer that spreads and destroys the soul. The death of Christ is to tell us a few things. Maybe I could illustrate it this way. I was speaking at the UN some years ago, and they asked me to speak on the search for absolutes in a pluralistic society. And you get about 18 minutes in which to do it, you know. So I told them the 4 absolutes we really look for: evil, justice, love, forgiveness. How do we define evil? How do we define justice? How do we define love? And when we blow it, how do we gain forgiveness? I said, these four realities you wrestle with. You talk about just societies as UN ambassadors. You talk about evil nations. You talk about missing your families because you love them. And some of you are going to blow it ethically and you're going to need to be forgiven. And they're all leaning forward and listening. Evil, justice, love, forgiveness. I said, we're all looking for those absolutes. I said, now let me ask you this. Where is the one place in history where these four converged? Evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. So they converged on a hill called Calvary, where Jesus offered his life, taking all the evil that was there, being a just God, expressing love, and saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Some years ago, India was subject to a terrible terrorist attack in the city of Mumbai. Two of the major hotels affected were the Oberoi Hotel and the most beautiful, both of them are beautiful hotels, the Taj Mahal Hotel. I've been there a few times to have a meal. They are lovely landmark hotels. And these boys broke in there and opened up their machine guns and just mowed people down. There are markers in the lobbies of both hotels for what happened that day. I happened to be there a few days after it happened, and I was in the Taj Mahal Hotel. That night I was watching the television news that was covering the story. The marks were still there. And an Indian-born English actor was being interviewed, and he told a remarkable story. Here's what he said. He said, I was in the Taj Mahal Hotel having dinner with my friends, and they were all mowed down. All of my friends were killed. The machine gun fire was going through our room. There were bloodied bodies. We were all piled up. He said, I dove over them, and I was right at the top. And I heard footsteps, and I knew it was this guy, the lead killer, who was walking towards us. I just closed my eyes and froze as best as I could. And he was right beside me. I knew his gun was trained on me. But he didn't pull the trigger. And he walked away. And the interviewer said to him, why do you think he didn't pull the trigger? He said, I don't know, ma'am. I really don't know. I only have one possible explanation, and that is this. I was so covered with the blood of my friends that he took me for dead and walked on to the next table to see who he could kill. In that simple metaphor, I was reminded of a conversation I had with a sheikh in Ramallah. We were talking about all the evils around there, and we were given a chance to ask him one question. I won't tell you what my question was because it was a private meeting, but I didn't like his answer. He's a muscle-bound kind of guy, could have broken me into two very easily. But I looked at him and I said, Sheikh, I may never see you again, but I just want to say to you this. 5,000 years ago, God commanded Abraham to take his son up a hill. I said, please, let's not debate which son. You know that he took his son up a hill. And as the axe is about to come down, God stops that arm and says, don't do it. I said, do you know that story? He said, yes. I said, what else did God say? God, through Abraham, said, I myself will provide. Stop. I myself will provide. I said, Sheikh, 2,000 years ago, a close walk from where you and I are sitting, God kept that promise. He took his own son up that hill, and this time the arm did not stop. The sheikh was just staring at me. I said, until you and I receive the son God has provided, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for position and power and land and prestige. He just stared at me. I said, that's all I want to say to you. The Archbishop who was with us said, I think it's time to go. So we left. And as we were walking down, the Archbishop was the guest of honor. This lead sheikh, who was a very vicious kind of guy in his history, served prison terms and all, took the Archbishop and ushered him into his car, and the others of us were going to our van. And I heard footsteps running behind me, and I looked over, and it was the sheikh coming after me. I said, that's it, I'm going to be buried in Ramallah. It's over, finished. He twirled me around. I have 2 titanium rods in my back holding me up. I figured my back was going to be in splinters that afternoon. He turned me around and he gripped me like that. And he kissed me on both sides of my face. He said, Mr. Zacharias, you're a good man. I hope someday I will see you again. It's not what you think it is, that God having a nice, satisfying moment to take his son to the cross. He promised thousands of years ago that he was going to send you the greatest gift and pay the greatest price so that you and I may be drawn to him. If you look at it through the lens of his eyes of love, rather than your own eyes of thinking this is some kind of child abuse or whatever it is, you will not fully come to the dissonance until you see him face to face. I would be willing to lay my life down for my children and my grandchildren. It would not be a pride thing to do. It would be an act of love and sacrifice because of who they are to me. He paid the biggest price to draw you and me to him. Read the Gospel of John 3 times in a row and ask him to speak to you and see if you come to the same conclusion that the question seems to intimate. I think you will have a different answer to it. That's what I want to say to you.
Wouldn't mind seeing the question on the screen once more, if that's all right. And it's a great question, and it goes back to our discussion of hell as well. This idea, why do I have to accept someone? You don't. You don't have to accept him. But I just think that's incredible, that God would give his life even for someone who doesn't have to accept him and who may not accept him. Is that a God that's all about himself? No, that is a God who's about others. And I think we just underestimate the love of who Jesus is. Someone who said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Someone who looked down from the cross and said, Father, forgive them. Someone who said, do to others what you would have them do to you. The golden rule. We just think of that now as if everyone in the ancient world said that. No one said that, and that was completely countercultural. That's Jesus' original research. The closest we get is Confucius. He said, don't inflict on others what you do not want inflicted on yourself. But the difference between those statements, that's the difference between saying don't punch someone in the face and build your enemy a hospital. The world did not fall in love with love until Jesus came. And that's what we see at the cross, the fact that he would die for people, even people who may not accept him. And if I could just give you one more encouragement, as I just plead with you, no, you don't have to accept him, but please accept him. And I implore you not only to accept his death, but the acceptance is greater than that. It's his resurrected life as well. He calls it the fullness of life, a life that he says will be characterized by love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and generosity and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. What would your life look like if it was overflowing with those things? I think to my own life, and I think about who I was before Christ, someone who would never ask for forgiveness. Why? Because if I needed to be forgiven, I was bad, and if I was bad, I was wrong, and if I was wrong, I was unlovable. Boy, that would have been a recipe for disaster in marriage. And now, to be someone living with Christ and to find joy in being able to just put my hand up and say, you know what, I was wrong, and will you please forgive me? And what a blessing that has been in the context of our marriage, a healthy relationship that I know would not be there otherwise. I was headed towards unfaithfulness, towards a marriage that would have been destroyed. And I stand here today because of the transformation I've seen by Christ in my life in a completely different place. So just to go back to something I said earlier, what are your expectations for life? What were they as a child? What were they 10 years ago, 5 years ago? What are they today? How great are they? You know, if your expectations for life are low enough, you can get away with being your own God. I did for a long time. If your expectation is to be well respected and run in the right circles, you can get away with the city being your God. If it's immediate pleasure, you can get away with sex being your God. But if you want something more, if you want the fullness of life, if you're willing to go back to that childhood idealism and say, you know what, there was something of God in that. I was intended for something more significant, for that fullness of life that Jesus talks about. Well, how big of a God will you need to make good on those expectations? And when you see life through that lens, through the lens that you were intended to see it and experience it and live it, I think only the God who is Jesus will do.
Thank you, Ravi and Vince. We're coming to the end of our time together, so I'd just like to ask if you'd like to offer us some final thoughts.
Try to keep mine brief. I've really told you what I wanted to tell you at the end there. Just one final thought. This is a thought from Blaise Pascal. He says, unless you love the truth, you cannot know the truth. We've talked about quite a lot this evening. We've talked about different reasons that you might take belief in God seriously. But you can only truly know someone in the deepest way if you actually make that personal commitment to love them first. I could know Joe to some extent before we decided to actually enter into a relationship. But it's actually only in the context of having made a personal choice and having stepped into a personal commitment that I could really know her in the deep way that I know her now. The same is true of God. You can ask the questions all day long, and the reality is I have more questions now than I did before I was a Christian. But at some point you have to say, I know enough to take a step of trust and enter into that relationship of trust and love. And it's in the context of that that your questions will be answered. And I have seen that in my own life. I have seen that time and time and time again on university campuses. Recently, I was on a university campus. Someone said, you know what? I know enough. Not all of my questions are answered, but I have seen enough. I have seen that this makes sense up here and down here. I want to make that decision to trust Jesus. And we prayed for him to do so. And after he prayed that prayer, he opened his eyes, and these were the very first words out of his mouth as a new Christian. He said, I have always felt alone and like I had to wear a mask, but now this is the first time in my life that I can be truly myself and take off that mask and be fully alive. That is something that only Jesus offers, and I hope every one of you will say yes to it.
I'll just keep it brief and express my thanks to those who've organized it and this wonderful evening. We look forward to coming back some year. Thank you all for coming. I'll just give you this parable. It comes from the Middle East. God is like the light. Blessing and prosperity are like the shadow. If you turn your back upon the light and chase the shadow, you will never catch up to it. If you follow the light, the shadow will always follow you. Turn your face towards him, and the blessing and prosperity will follow you. You chase success and pleasure, you will never, ever catch up to it. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. God bless you, and thank you for having us. Thank you.